is Cameron, and I'm going to be giving a brief review and reflection on the LGBTQ+ young adult novel titled The Gentleman's Guide to Vice and Virtue by Mackenzi Lee. I found this book to be an insightful read, as well as very exciting, and a really good look into the struggles of different groups of people. Too much of the story away, given that there are many interesting twists and turns, I want to first discuss what this novel is about. Just to set up the setting, the story takes place around 1800s Europe. To start off, among a number of different characters, the story of Henry Montague, or Monty as he is sometimes called, Percy Newton, and Felicity Montague are the characters we follow for the entirety of the story. Their relationships with one another are important to consider as well. Henry and Percy are friends and then progress to lovers throughout the story, and Henry and Felicity are siblings. What eventually leads our characters to the conflict later on in the novel is all three of their original intentions for leaving home. Henry's being given the opportunity to go on tour, as it is called, which is basically him being allowed to explore Europe for about a year. However, his strict father does place many restrictions on him before his departure, some of which include no excessive drinking and a guy named Mr. Lockwood forced to accompany him. Along with Lockwood, Percy and Felicity are to accompany him while on tour as well. When they eventually reach Marseilles, Felicity will leave them to attend finishing school, and Henry, Percy, and Lockwood will continue to travel across Europe. After the year is up and the tour is finished, they will collect Felicity, and Percy will have to leave to attend school in Holland. What really jumpstarts the story is when the four of these characters attend a high-class party in Paris, France. It is there that Henry steals a box that belongs to the Duke of Bourbon just to spite him. After some drama at the party, Henry, Percy, Felicity, and Lockwood decide to leave in a rush. What Henry did not consider is that the Duke would want his property back, and that is exactly what happens. Henry, Percy, and Felicity are forced to abandon Lockwood in their flight from the Duke. The group find themselves on the journey to understand more about the box Henry stole. In Marseilles, they learn who the box belongs to. In Barcelona, they meet the owners and learn the contents of the box. And in Venice, they have to make a choice on what they want to do with the box's contents. Basically, what the box holds is the Lazarus key that unlocks a tomb in which they will find a preserved heart by means of alchemy in a woman's body that supposedly holds the cure-all for any disease. This heart is called the Panacea. I could be pronouncing that wrong. One of the more focused topics in this book is the relationship between Henry and Percy. It is implied that Henry is bisexual. He has multiple relationships with both men and women in the past, but who he truly loves is Percy. A lot of the novel revolves around Henry trying to understand his feelings for his friend, as well as Percy's reactions to being on the receiving end of Henry's affection. Another reason I point out the relationship is because a lot of the decisions in the book are made out of Henry trying to do what he thinks is best for Percy. Given that Percy has epilepsy, and Henry thinks that using the panacea on Percy is the only way to help him and make him happy. One of the most significant text-to-world connections that can be made from this novel is its embodiment of issues that we see in our own lives. This is achieved through the novel's three main characters. Percy represents racism, Felicity represents sexism, Henry represents homophobia. Although raised in an English household and with a decent amount of wealth, Percy is still treated like he is inferior to others. Henry and Felicity are exceptions of this rule, along with a small handful of other characters. The quote provided for Percy shows how he recognizes how others perceive him. In this quote specifically, Percy is growing frustrated with Henry due to the fact that Henry is a little bit ignorant of the plights Percy is forced to face. Where Henry is able to get away with mostly anything because he is, quote, the light-skinned son of an earl, end quote, Percy doesn't have the same luxury. Moving on to Felicity, she demonstrates gender expectations and also exhibits a clear defiance of them. Whereas she is expected to go to finishing school and become a proper lady, she has a different ambition. She wants to study medicine despite it being something that she is heavily discouraged from pursuing. She doesn't let the words of others stop her and continues to indulge in her passion for medicine throughout the novel's entirety. This quote shows just one of the examples where she does just that. Finally, homophobia and its effects are presented clearly through Henry. This quote is a part of Henry's internal monologue as he recalls the many times his father has beaten him. Instead of seeing something wrong with his father, Henry sees something wrong with himself. He blames his pursuit of men on his father's distaste for him and begins to think that if he repressed these feelings, he would be better off. Henry even begins to think that he would be better off dead because of the lack of acceptance he feels from his father and the rest of society. All of these stories from Percy, Felicity, and Henry represent the racism, sexism, and homophobia that we still see in our world today. Although it's not nearly as bad as it was in the 1800s, these harmful ways of thinking still remain with some people today, or are sometimes just still inherently taught to young children, which makes the story's discussion of these topics important to reflect on. Another interesting interesting connection that I was able to make in regard to the text was its connection to myself. More specifically, the portrayal of siblings in this novel is what I found myself relating to. The relationship that Henry and Felicity had with one another is one that reminded me a lot of my relationship with my own brother. Henry and Felicity shared a bond that was hard to define. While the two constantly act like they hate one another, they still find time to drop their barriers and come together in moments of sincerity. They are there for one another even though they act as if they couldn't care less about the other. This reminds me of me and my brother. We are two completely different people, which causes us to fight and have many disagreements, but at the end of the day we are still brother and sister and are there for each other. An example of this complexity can be seen many times throughout the novel. One point in particular that stands out to me is when Henry gets a bit of his ear shot off by the Duke of Bourbon near the end of the story. After Henry gains consciousness from this injury, Percy is there at his side and informs him that Felicity did all she could to fix him up and save as much of his ear as possible. Henry's response to this is that he wants to take off part of her ear in retaliation. Felicity cares about her brother, so she uses her medical knowledge and talent to fix an injury of his. Although Henry seems ungrateful in his response, he does feel much gratitude for everything his sister has done for him. The two recognize their affection for one another, yet still keep up the facade of feuding siblings. What they have is complicated, and I know that I and many other sibling duos in the world can relate to Henry and Felicity. In an article titled, "Where is all the sibling literature for adults?" Catherine Noel discusses how young adult fiction does a, quote, "great job of showing the range of complicated relationships we have with our siblings," end quote. She goes on to define this complexity as, quote, "enraging, sustaining, destructive, and redemptive," end quote. Considering that the novel makes a deliberate choice to follow along with Noel's idea of sibling relationships through Henry and Felicity, and the fact that I myself can relate to its portrayal, goes to show the importance of implementing such elements in young adult literature. Sibling relationships are not always perfect for everyone. It's important to create safe places such as texts like these where young readers can find relatability in the story's characters. The next thing I would like to cover is answering this question: is this particular novel appropriate for young adults to read? I believe this novel is appropriate for young adults because saying it is inappropriate harms those who would benefit from reading it. It is important in the sense that it addresses many issues that maybe some young adults face in their own lives. It gives these readers a chance to feel validated in their own experiences. Also, it opens the door for conversation for those who maybe haven't dealt with the same hardships. As I mentioned before in one of my previous slides, this novel touches upon themes of racism, sexism, and homophobia through its three main characters, Henry, Percy, and Felicity. Some adults may find that addressing these topics is inappropriate for young adults because it is introducing them to concepts that they may not understand, or because they believe discussions of such topics are raunchy, irrelevant, or forcing some agenda. I argue differently. Because this novel is told through the perspective of Henry, I will focus on topics of homophobia and queer love to explain why I think these discussions are important to have. If we remain ignorant of the existence of members of the LGBTQ+ community, all we are doing is creating environments where nobody feels safe to be themselves or express themselves genuinely. This is especially important to think about in classroom settings, as a young adult's education is typically vital to much of that student's future. Students deserve to feel safe when in the classroom, and that starts with being accepting of literature that does not shy away from the lives of all different types of people. Moving back to Henry, the argument can be made for the appropriateness of the novel itself through the depiction of the negative treatment gay and bisexual men receive in Henry's time. When Henry knows that he has to flirt with another man in order to convince him to loan him some money, he explains how he knew that this man was somebody safe to act this way with. If Henry wasn't cautious and accidentally flirted with somebody that wasn't interested in men, he could be found out and charged with death. This is an idea that can be seen and summarized in a text called Unhappy Queers by Sarah Ahmed. She explains how following a thing called a happiness script, quote, encourages us to avoid the unhappy consequences of deviation, end quote. In other words, only telling stories of queer relationships that end unhappily does nothing but discourage people from pursuing a similar type of love. This is why Mackenzi Lee's novel is appropriate for young adults who are a part of this community. Henry and Percy get a happy ending by the end of the novel. They confess their love to one another and end up staying together. Despite deviating from this happiness script that tells them to find safety in heterosexuality, they are still able to find their own happiness. The final question I want to answer is how this novel is appealing to young adults. One of the first appealing elements of this novel is its normalization of same-sex relationships. Although considered taboo by the society they live in, the author makes an effort to emphasize how Henry and Percy's relationship is natural and genuine. Mackenzi Lee does not treat the two men as anomalies. In the article, Watch What You Teach, a first-year teacher refuses to play it safe, it is stressed that understanding societal norms that are toxic along with tackling them is essential. The article discusses how the attack on queer love is dehumanizing and invalidates an entire group of people. This is why Henry and Percy's relationship could be refreshing for young adults to read, because it humanizes the LGBTQ plus community. Another appealing aspect of this novel is its tackling of a search for identity. Henry tries to separate himself from his father and become his own person. Percy tries to grow beyond racial stereotypes and to prove himself capable, and Felicity defies gender expectations in her academic pursuits in medicine. All three of the novel's main characters align with this basic idea that adolescents are pursuing their sense of self. In order to achieve this, adolescents often have to, quote, try on a different number of identities, end quote, which is what our main characters attempt in their defiance of the things that they believe keep them from being their true selves. Finally, although it does not align with anything like relating to themes in our world or the adolescent experience, the humor littered throughout the novel is definitely one of its biggest appealing parts. For example, there's this run-on joke throughout the novel where Henry just doesn't know how to properly throw a punch. On page 111, Felicity scolds him for bruising his hand by forgetting to untuck his thumb from his fist before dealing a punch. On page 411, he makes the same mistake again despite Felicity already correcting him, and another person has to tell him to untuck it. Finally, on page 467, Henry's about to throw another punch at somebody, but then, quote, at the last second untucks his thumb from inside his palm, end quote. Another funny part of this novel are Henry's internal monologues. The second quote provided on the slide is just one of the many sarcastic jokes he makes to himself when regarding those around him. His monologues often include self-deprecating jokes or comical outbursts for his love for Percy. Thank you so much for listening to my review and reflection on Mackenzi Lee's LGBTQ plus young adult novel, The Gentleman's Guide to Vice and Virtue. Although I just thought I would end by including a map of the journey that Henry and Felicity and Percy take throughout the novel's entirety. The map can be found on the first 2 pages before the first chapter where the book begins. Feel free to pause the video if you want to look more closely at it. Here's my reference list, which includes all the sources I referenced throughout the video, and thanks again for watching.